Good morning. My name is Sam. I am an alcoholic and I'm also a son of recovery. Let's start out with the Serenity Prayer. Good and gracious God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. So I'm reading through the 12 steps and the 12 secular steps by Bill W. I'm in the second chapter called The Biology of Addiction, and I'm finally at the end of it. So we're just going to finish this out today. Addiction creates dangerous positive feedback loops. We know that addiction comes from the dysregulation of the normal balance of excitatory, positive, and inhibitory, negative, neurotransmitter controls. Specifically, addiction has its beginning in the imbalance of unusually strong excitatory dopamine rewards over inhibitory signaling. We'll now discuss how this imbalance can create a very dangerous situation known as a positive feedback loop. We can use a thermostat and furnace as an example of how the normal balance of positive and negative feedback can be catastrophically upset by the establishment of a positive feedback loop. When a thermostat registers a room's temperature, perhaps 75 degrees, as a few degrees below a set point, let's say 78, it will send an activating positive signal to the furnace and turn it off to on. The furnace now performs this function and creates heat. This is the positive side of the loop. When enough heat has been produced to raise the room temperature to the desired level, the thermostat responds by sending negative feedback, inhibition, which returns the furnace to its off state. The regulated balance between the negative and positive feedback keeps the room temperature within a comfortable range. Overall, this is stability. A positive feedback loop can arise when the inhibitory part of the system, the brakes, is defective, overridden, or disabled and cannot produce sufficient negative feedback, inhibition, to turn the effector off. What makes the situation so bad is the fact that once the positive feed has turned the furnace on, it stays on and continues to produce an effect beyond the normal range. The system will become unstable, and the inability to shut down the furnace means the production of heat now becomes amplified way beyond the set point. Excessiveness is what makes a positive feedback loop so dangerous, and excessiveness is the very heart of addiction. That is true. In a positive feedback loop, production doesn't stop until either a backup inhibitory control mechanism or some outside event shuts the system down. In our example, the fuel to the furnace will likely run out and return the system to the off state, but sometimes an outside intervention will more dramatically turn the system off, like if the house burns down in the furnace example. Let's look at the nature of the positive feedback loop as it applies to alcoholism. When an alcoholic downs the first drink, there is no controlling what happens from that point onward. The reward system is turned on, the gas pedal is engaged, dopamine production, and the brakes, the GABA signaling and cortex-based judgment, are cut or disabled. We have a positive feedback loop. The effect, drunkenness, will be amplified, and the binge will stop when the person runs out of money or alcohol, or wrecks a car, or is arrested, or passes out due to the depressant effect of alcohol. The person was not in control. External forces were. The conscious experience of a positive feedback loop to the alcoholic is if one drink feels good, a dozen more will feel great. Their mind gets locked into a go-go-go mode. There usually is no chemical, GABA signaling, or rational cortex-based process strong enough to intervene and say, that's enough. For the alcoholic, the first drink is followed by an inability to moderate. Wilson was correct when he emphasized that alcoholics drink for the effect, but because of an allergy, we lack any control over the effect. This description of alcoholism as an allergy was a very astute hypothesis in the 1930s, for the first drink to an alcoholic is physiologically very similar to the bee sting in someone allergic to bee venom. Just as dopamine acts as a gas pedal on the production of pleasure, there are small chemical activators throughout the body that act as gas pedals on the production of inflammation. GABA and other inhibitors quickly shut down dopamine activity so that only a little pleasure is produced, just enough to reinforce a nice behavior. The same is true for small chemical activators that create inflammation, histamine, and bradykinin, but for sake of simplicity, we'll just use histamine. Histamine release and activity is normally opposed by inhibitors that quickly shut off its activity limit and that limits its effect. In a normal person, a bee sting causes a little redness, pain, and swelling at the site of the sting. In an allergic person, the brakes fail to stop histamine, and so the production of inflammation rapidly grows out of control, like a campfire suddenly spreading through a dry, windy forest. The unrestrained rise in inflammation overflows throughout the body via the bloodstream. When this inflammation hits the airways, it will cause them to constrict and the throat to swell. This can cause a potentially fatal inability to breathe. When it hits the skin, hives will appear. The inflammatory reaction also causes all the small arteries to dilate, and in response, the blood pressure drops dramatically, and the allergic person passes out. The positive feedback loops in addiction and in allergy are very similar when we look at the chemistry. In both cases, a small chemical exposure, bee venom, alcohol, cocaine, initiates the activity of a small molecular activator. But the lack of inhibition of that activator results in a dangerous chain reaction and amplification of effect that can prove potentially fatal. We can draw a very important conclusion from this inevitable chain of chemical events that frequently follows the first drink or drug in an addict. We must avoid that first drink or drug, just as folks allergic to bee venom must avoid getting stung by bees. Abstinence is the necessary action of recovery. But why is it so difficult in the case of mood-altering drugs? Willpower and abstinence are going to be difficult to attain when it comes to a pathology of the reward center, because the reward center is the master regulator of pleasure and motivation. Bee stings do not release pleasure. They release painful inflammation that we'll want to avoid. Drugs release considerable pleasure, a huge positive reinforcement. So by the rules of operant condition, we will strongly avoid allergies that overproduce inflammation, yet we will doggedly pursue addictions that overproduce pleasure. Addicts have lots of chemically driven willpower and motivation in the pursuit of their addiction. Addiction is just an unfortunate risk of having a brain equipped with a limbic system, complete with reward center. In evolutionary terms, the limbic system has been referred to as the reptilian brain because reptiles pretty much have a spinal cord, limbic system, and just a little dab of brain cells that can compute information about future consequences. Reptiles respond to the world in ways that are reflexive, emotion-driven, and very self-centered. They get angry and strike. They smell pheromones and mate. They lay eggs then leave. Unfortunately, as addiction progresses, it empowers the tendency toward this limbic way of life. If it feels good, do it. It is often not until the late stages of addiction that negative consequences and the pain of crisis tip the balance toward a desire for recovery. Until that happens, anyone who doesn't want recovery need not worry. And now, we have more bad news about the biology of addiction. We've only covered the positive feedback loop of the reward center. This explains how loss of inhibition, loss of brakes, on reward production causes an inability to moderate how much we use whenever we use a substance. I was rarely worried about overdose. It was the possibility of underdosage that kept me anxious. But there is another important aspect about the addictive drive that we should consider. It's the motivational power of the addictive drive. This motivational engine is responsible for the chronic pattern of use over and again despite negative consequences. The fully developed addictive drive. Though the biology has not been definitively established, I believe that a second positive feedback loop is involved in creating a fully developed addictive drive. Bill Wilson was once again very insightful when he described alcoholism as a disease consisting of two components, an allergy to alcohol coupled with an incessant phenomenon of craving for the very substance that sets off the allergy. It is this ceaseless craving that generates our long-term use despite the ever-rising costs. It silences our judgment, bribes our conscience, and creates the motivation, that pure willpower to get that drug or drink or drug despite any barriers. I'm going to read that line again. It silences our judgment, bribes our conscience, and creates motivation, the pure willpower to get that drink or drug despite any barriers. As we get farther away from our last use, the addictive voice and cravings get stronger. If we go a day without a taste to take the edge off, we will find it very difficult to white-knuckle it through a second or third day. The addictive voice kicks into high gear. When I was so deep into my addiction that I absolutely dreaded using or drinking again, it was always disappointing how quickly I would give in and use again. We have just described psychological dependence, and we have yet to add physical dependence to our list of biological changes in addiction progression. Physical dependence develops after extended use of powerfully addictive drugs such as alcohol, opiates, heroin, narcotic painkillers, and benzodiazepine variants, benzos, such as Xanax or Valium. Physical dependence is evidenced by physical withdrawal symptoms. Unfortunately, physical withdrawal occurs during the same time frame when the cravings produced by psychological withdrawal are also hitting a peak. The combination of the two is very often unbearable. Nothing seduces, psychologically distorts, and eventually creates a desolate emptiness in one's core, quite like addiction does. The obsession is most powerful when we are alone, but the consequences eventually pile up, and crisis will take us to a point where we can no longer continue this path, and yet we cannot turn from it either. We hit bottom. Although many addicts hit a classic bitter end, the I lost everything to my addiction kind of bottom is not an absolute necessity as a first step toward recovery. Awareness, a conscious knowledge of our condition created through assessment and intervention, can help an addict cut through their own deceptions and arrive at an honest, heartfelt acknowledgement of their addiction and the need to do something about it. Early intervention can save lives, and effective assessments are invaluable tools in early recovery. We will cover more on these subsequent chapters. The strength of the addictive drive. We should not underestimate how firmly addictions can establish themselves. Active addiction will persist and escalate, often until very significant outside events intervene to shut down the cycle of use. Going broke, getting arrested, the collapse of relationships and family ties, serious injury to ourselves or others, these are just a few examples of how big intervening events can be. Yet, for some addicts, the addictive cycle persists, even grows stronger, despite negative consequences that can be somewhat biblical in nature. We can directly measure the strength of an addict's addictive drive by an inventory of their consequences to date. We will later discuss using this very thing as a motivational tool during the first 90 days of sobriety. The risk factors of addiction. Not everyone who indulges frequently will become an addict. For instance, there are many social, moderate users of alcohol and marijuana. Their patterns of drug use may somewhat resemble their driving patterns. They sometimes roll through stop signs and sometimes exceed speed limits, and they may have to deal with traffic tickets from time to time, but their patterns don't progress to consequences like incarceration, bankruptcy, divorce, and severe damage to their ability to function in life. Bear in mind that while it's true, most people in a population will not become addicts or alcoholics. That means very little when evaluating the risk to any specific individual. An individual's genetic makeup will have an important effect on their risk. Also, some drugs are powerful enough to enslave anyone who uses them regularly. The individual's upbringing and childhood experiences with drugs will additionally have a profound effect on their vulnerability to addiction. This is a topic we will return to in the next chapter. Nature versus nurture on the susceptibility to addiction. The genetic predisposition to alcoholism and other addictions can come in the form of inherited genes that result in weak inhibitory systems or overly sensitive gas pedals on the reward system. These susceptibilities can also be influenced by childhood exposures to addictive substances, including nicotine, alcohol, painkillers, THC, the active ingredients of marijuana, and others. The brain is profoundly sensitive to drugs up to and beyond adolescence. Also, many of us learn to become addicts through imitation of what we see while growing up, or through the cultural glorification of excessive alcohol and drug use. Even the pervasive materialism, so prominent in most cultures, constantly programs us to forego moderation and intensely pursue personal gratification. We should keep in mind that control over pleasure production takes two forms. First, there is an innate control in the form of inhibitory neurotransmitters, which I described earlier as brakes in the reward center. The genetic susceptibility to addiction involves genes that give us weak brakes in inhibitory neurotransmitter systems, or overly sensitive gas pedals, dopamine systems, that can increase the risk of addiction. The second level of ability to moderate pleasure lies in acquired, learned, cerebrum-based cognitive controls that we know as good judgment. A healthy upbringing that fosters self-control and healthy cognitive and behavioral development goes a long way in protecting an individual from addiction. Step work in 12-step recovery programs is meant to do the same thing. In other words, good thoughts and decisions can help us fight addiction. We can learn from animal models of addiction. Take note that nearly every substance that produces addiction in humans will do the same in nearly any other mammal, or our mammalian cousins have brain structures very similar to ours. In experiments where monkeys or rats are given the means to self-administer cocaine at will, they quickly become severely addicted. Outcome is often fatal, for the addictive drive eventually proves stronger than the drive for food and water. Opiates have similar effects, but tend to be a little less severe than direct injection of cocaine. Experiments have even shown that the creation of the addictive drive can be achieved without any external drug or stimuli. Animals can be experimentally set up to directly stimulate their brain's reward system via an electrode that activate at will. Once again, self-control can be quickly abolished. Conclusions of the biology of addiction. We can conclude at this point that addiction is a disorder of drives, and the establishment of this drive programs our brains and locks the addict into an addictive cycle of repeated use that causes an ever-widening circle of harm. For many addicts, this cycle eventually reaches a point where disastrous consequences are finally equal to or greater than the motivation or means to keep feeding the addictive drive. We hit bottom. We then seek help or are forced into it. If active addiction continues beyond that point, the train's final stops are jails, institutions, and death. Well, I find that the biology of addiction is really important to know. I think it's important for especially all of us, all of ourselves, all of us, all of the addicts out there. I know it can be really boring, but I think it's important that we all hear it at least once, just so that we know where we can go to look to find it when we might need it again. But just to hear about what goes on in our bodies and our brains, and how some people have really good inhibitors, and some of us need some help with them, and that's okay because we're all different. But I do find it very important to read this. So I'm really glad that he included a chapter like that in this book. So, without further ado, here is a wonderful prayer. Heart of a child. Grant me, O God, the heart of a child, pure and transparent as a spring, a simple heart which never harbors sorrows, a heart glorious in self-giving, tender in compassion, a heart faithful and generous, which will never forget any good or bear any grudge for any evil. Make me a heart gentle and humble, loving without asking in return, large-hearted and undoubtable, which no ingratitude can sour, and no indifference weary. A heart born to help others, usefulness never measured. So with that, I ask you, please leave any comments, questions, or thoughts, and as always, I hope you have a blessed day. Thanks.